and current, relevant to our legislative work and current. And this fall, for those of you who may not have been able to attend, the House Continuing Education sessions have included the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid expansion, and domestic violence. And I hope I'm not misspeaking when I say that they are archived on the web. Those were all streamed. So I hope that today you'll find our program today as informative and valuable as the feedback that I've received from the other ones. Today's topic addresses the Common Core state standards and why New Hampshire's Board of Education, and in fact the boards of 45 other states as well, have adopted them. Over the last few months, there have been various articles on the Common Core standards. They've been occurring frequently in New Hampshire newspapers. Unfortunately, I think one thing that happens when you get a new program, occasionally there are rumors and misinformation that go around, so I trust that today's session will shed some light on this for everyone here. Meanwhile, many New Hampshire school districts have already begun to implement the standards and to revise their curricula. As a former high school math teacher, our education system is really important to me, so I'm very pleased that we're talking about increasing our curricula standards, and pleased that we're doing that. In endorsing the standards, the State Board of Education also recognized that local schools really play a key role in this, and that's why school board members, parents, teachers, they're all involved in workshops and other activities that are similar to today's work so that they too can learn as much as they can before making their final decisions. But today is a day for legislators to learn about the Common Core state standards, why they exist, who developed them, the strengths and challenges that New Hampshire school districts are experiencing, and to discuss how each district will work with them. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have NCSL consultants here that will provide a national perspective on what's happening with the Common Core state standards. The day will conclude with 2 work sessions, one on assessment and one on a teacher's point of view. Most importantly, legislators will learn how such standards will improve educational experiences for New Hampshire students so that they will graduate from high school, career, and college ready for the next step in their life's journey. I do want to take a moment to thank the House Education Committee Chair, Representative Mary Stewart Guile, and the House staff for organizing the day for us today. I also want to thank Tom Raffio and the State Board of Education, Dr. Marc Tucker and NCSL, as well as our panel today for participating, and also give a shout out to Delta Dental for providing the lunch for today's program. So again, I hope you will find today's information helpful, and I wish you an excellent day.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you especially for your ongoing support and enabling legislators such as myself to plan days like we are going to experience today. And also I would like to reiterate a special thanks to Ann Fitzgerald, Jim Cianci, Heather Ebbs, and Pete. And I'm sorry, I apologize, I don't know who Pete's last name is, but he's the one that sets up all the room and in combination with Scott Group gets all of the technical equipment ready for in-service days like today. And they have been working very hard over the last week, well actually over the last month, to prepare for today's session. Good morning, and to reiterate the speakers, welcome, welcome. Today's event has been planned in cooperation with the Legislative Caucus for Children and Youth, a legislative caucus that is over 15 years old and began in 1997 to introduce and monitor legislation affecting children and youth and to plan continuing education affecting children and youth, such as the one we're here today. This is about our 5th or 6th form or summer over the 15 years believe it or not, when we got together last year to talk about revitalizing the Legislative Caucus for Young Children, we decided that it would be really great to have a big event in the fall on continuing education. And when we talked about various topics, because children and youth covers a broad span of development and learning, we decided that we would focus on the Common Core state standards, long before the media got hold of them. And I say that because I have had a number of queries from the media in the last couple of days saying, did you plan this because of all of the media attention that the Common Core standards have received? And I said, oh no, the plan for this particular event was in the works last spring. The goal that we have in planning today's continuing education is to enable every legislator who attends, and legislators do have a choice about whether or not they choose to attend the continuing education activities, to enable every legislator to be informed of the facts, to get lots of information, so that when they get queries from their constituents, they can respond with facts, with information, and they can also respond with the fact that there are people in the state, in addition to the local educators, in addition to our State Department of Education, and in addition to others, that there are people in the state who are very experienced in this area and who are available to them to help answer any questions that they may have. As far as the other job that I assigned myself today was just to give you an overview of the logistics. We will be meeting in this room for this morning and for the afternoon's first session, and then finally for the wrap-up at 3 or 3:15. The other meetings, or the other rooms that we are occupying today, are rooms 205 and 207. That's where we're going to have lunch. It will be served cafe style. And later in the afternoon, the work sessions will be held in room 206 and 208. And I'll announce which work session is going to be in which room later on. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to call your attention to the white cards on the chairs. These are available for you to write your questions on, and Dr. Tucker has indicated that he will address all the questions at the end of this presentation. There's more information to follow, but right now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marc Tucker, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. But before I do, I also would ask that you turn off your electronic devices when Dr. Tucker comes to the podium. Marc Tucker is President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Center of Education and the Economy. He is internationally recognized as an expert on academic and occupational standards and assessment, and has also been among the leaders in researching the policies and practices of the countries with the best education systems in the world. Dr. Tucker served in the 70s as the Associate Director of the National Institute of Education, in charge of the nation's government-funded research on education policy. He then created the Carnegie Forum on Education and the Economy at Carnegie Corporation of New York, and authored its report, A Nation Prepared: Teachers for the 21st Century. He led the Carnegie Forum as it created the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and served as the board's first president. Excuse me. Tucker then founded the National Center on Education and the Economy, and in that role created the Commission on the Skills of the American Workforce, the new Commission on the Skills of the American Workforce, the New Standards Consortium, America's Choice, a comprehensive school reform program, the National Institute for School Leadership and Excellence for All, which is a high school reform program. He was cited by President Clinton as a major intellectual contributor to Clinton administration education and labor policies. He was appointed by the President to the National Skills Standards Board, and he also served as co-author and editor of many articles and several books. And he has many publications, but I would mention one, Surpassing Shanghai, which is my Bible on education. And I would heartily recommend that if you are interested in knowing where America stands in relation to other countries and what kinds of things we should be doing in order to make our students as competitive as they can be on the world stage, that is a great book. Mr. Tucker has testified frequently in the U.S. Congress and the state legislature, and you know what? Dr. Tucker is a New Englander. He lives in Maine and drove down to be here today with his dog Maggie. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Tucker.
Thank you, Mary. It is really good to be back here in New Hampshire. I have all these memories as a child of coming here in our summers. I hugely enjoy this state. These are hysterical times, not historical times, hysterical times. My visit to New Hampshire to talk about the Common Core state standards was heralded by the New Hampshire Tea Party Coalition in an article that describes me as a socialist, an advocate for federal control of education in the United States, an evangelist for outcomes-based education, a believer in the UN content standards, that the United Nations content standards should be imposed on the United States. Indeed, it is said that I actually met once with David Rockefeller Jr., who is described as probably the most evil globalist in the world, and perhaps, worst of all, that I am a friend of Hillary. Most telling, that I am a Constitution buster. The truth actually is a whole lot less exciting. I'm not a socialist, but a lifelong Democrat with a deep belief in capitalism, who has many friends who are prominent Republicans. I have written extensively decrying increasing federal control of education as unconstitutional and advocating greater state authority in education. Far from an advocate of outcomes-based education, I have consistently opposed it. There are no United Nations content standards for education. They do not exist. So, I could not have supported them. I have met with David Rockefeller and with Hillary Clinton, both of whom actually have been friends and both have been board members of my organization. The same, however, can be said of Senator Bill Brock. Bill Brock chaired the Republican Party when Ronald Reagan ran successfully for president. And he served in two important positions in Reagan's cabinet. John Engler, the former Republican governor of Michigan, who went on to head the National Association of Manufacturers and the Business Roundtable, is also a friend. I'd like, if I may, to set the hysteria aside for a moment and talk with you about where these standards came from and why they are so important for New Hampshire. The United States led the world in education for at least a century. In the 19th century, it was way ahead in extending the right to a free elementary school education to all of its citizens. At the turn of the last century, it was way ahead in offering a high school education to everybody who wanted one. After World War II, this country jumped far ahead in sending its young people to college. The result was the best educated workforce in the world by a country mile for probably 50 years. Many economists think that this record in education made us the richest country in the world in the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s, and also contributed greatly to the fact that 40 years ago we had not only the highest income, but also the most evenly distributed income of any industrialized country. And then it all fell apart. From the 1970s on, all this growth in access to education and in the quality of education stopped, dead in the water. The only thing that has grown from then on has been the cost of education, which has more than doubled at all levels after accounting for inflation. The 1980s was a time of enormous change in the global economy. At the end of that decade, manufacturing wages in South Korea were 1/10 of what they were in the United States. Manufacturing wages in mainland China were 1/100th of what they were in the United States. Unskilled and semi-skilled jobs started to move to East Asia from the developed countries, first in a trickle and then in a full-fledged flood. By the end of the 1990s, it was clear to many of us that high-skilled jobs We're also moving to China and India, not just the low-skilled jobs, but the high-skilled jobs. We're moving to China and India because both countries were able to produce increasingly large numbers of highly skilled and educated workers who were, like the less skilled workers, happy to work for much less than equivalently skilled Americans. Economists were beginning to ask why the world's employers should pay Americans far more than their counterparts in Asia when they had the same skills. And there was no good answer to that question. But for every job that was lost to Asian workers, 10 jobs were being lost to automation. Many of those jobs were low-wage, low-skill jobs, but many were high-skilled, high-paid jobs. The common element was that they all involved routine work. If the work was routine, it could be reduced to an algorithm. And if it could be reduced to an algorithm, it could be automated. The gathering forces were producing increasing numbers of Americans who used to have good middle-class jobs, but were now either working at the 7-Eleven or at Walmart at far lower wages or not working at all. Their jobs were being destroyed by low-wage competition from Asia or by increasingly inexpensive automated equipment. You recognize this picture here in New Hampshire? A very clear picture was emerging from all of this for the highly developed, high-wage countries. The future would be increasingly bleak for those without high skills. But high skills by themselves would not be enough. If those jobs involved routine work, they too could be automated. The jobs that would survive would go to those who were not only highly educated, but highly flexible. Those who would be in the best position would be those who were most creative, the most innovative, the best communicators, the best at working in groups in which one was a leader at one moment and a follower in another. The workers who survived would be the workers that could offer their services to many employers at once, often in different roles, acting as self-employed contingent workers or as entrepreneurs. Flexibility would be the watchword, creativity the byword. Learning to learn would have to become much more than a slogan. Education, a very demanding kind of education, would be far more necessary to economic survival than ever before. Other countries had seen this coming long before we did. From the 70s and 80s on, they did what was necessary to educate not just an elite, but nearly everybody to a standard that they had only educated an elite to before. Those were the countries that were beating the pants off us, the countries my organization has been studying for the last 25 years. In every single case, they started by setting high standards. Before they set their own standards, they looked at their competitors. And then they set their own standards in the light of what they found. They de-emphasized rote memory and the learning of simple procedures. And they put in their place standards that stressed real understanding of the subjects they required their students to study. They made sure that their standards and their curricula had a certain logic, so that what a student studied in any given year was what was needed for the more advanced studies to be undertaken by their students in the following year. In almost every case, the standards they produced were national standards, produced in some cases by the national government, in other cases by their states and provinces working together. These top performers knew that no tool in their toolkit would be more essential for economic success in the globalized era than setting high, clear standards for all their students. National standards for student achievement is not a socialist plot. It is not anti-American. It is a common sense policy measure that has been undertaken by countries with political systems as different as Singapore and Finland, Australia and Germany. Nothing these top performing countries could have done would have done more to dramatically raise the expectations among teachers, parents, and the community at large for their children. They made sure that the skills and knowledge they would demand from their students would be sufficient to enable these students to look forward to a rewarding and productive future in a world in which low skills and routine skills would no longer be anywhere near enough. They understood the realism of the old saw that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. They knew that teachers everywhere teach to the test, and teachers would try to put together a curriculum that would make their students successful on the test, so they wanted to be clear about what the tests needed to test, because they would otherwise never achieve their goals. Many of our top competitors were well down this road in 1990. The United States was far behind. This has actually never been, in this country, a partisan matter. President H.W. Bush got the ball rolling when in 1989, he called the first ever meeting of the governors with the president to talk about education goals. It was the first President Bush, a Republican, who asked his Secretary of Education, Lamar Alexander, the former Republican governor of Tennessee, to put the first money on the table to develop performance standards. Many Democrats expected President Bush's successor, Bill Clinton, to reverse this policy when he took office. He did nothing of the kind. Instead, he proposed Goals 2000, which included a provision requiring the states to develop their own standards. When George W. Bush became president, he ratcheted up the pressure several notches. He had hoped to require the states to adopt a single set of national standards. Maybe you didn't know that, but that's what happened. But that goal was frustrated by the Congress, so he settled for making sure that the National Assessment of Educational Progress would produce a report on every state's students against the frameworks developed by NAEP and report those scores to the public. The critics of the Common Core would have you believe that the Common Core was produced by the Obama administration. Not true. Not even close. The truth is much more interesting. Governors of both parties were growing more and more frustrated. They were being held increasingly accountable by their constituencies for economic development. But the companies they were trying to recruit were telling them they would not come unless the governor could convince them that the quality of education in their state would radically improve. Many of these companies were very much aware of the accomplishments in education of our best competitors overseas, and they could easily build new plants and relocate old ones in the countries that were outperforming us. The governors began to clamor for higher standards, education standards, in the United States, and if possible, uniform standards. They turned to their own association to get the job done. At the same time, the average state scores from the National Assessment of Education Progress were beginning to come out. It turned out that the states with the highest scores on their own assessments often have the lowest average state scores on the NAEP Common Assessment. State commissioners from the lower performing states went to their association and said, in effect, I cannot get the support I need to raise the standards in my state by myself. We need to work together as an association to come up with common standards. If the association will do that, then I'll be able to get my state to sign up for the standards we create as an association. The Bill and Melinda Gates Association provided the money to the two associations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided the money to the two associations to work together to get the job done. The money didn't come from the federal government, nor was the federal government involved in any way in deciding what the standards were going to be. All of this got started before Barack Obama was elected president. The drive to much higher standards and a different kind of standards is not unique to the United States. It is a worldwide movement among the most developed countries. Indeed, the United States is very late to the game. While the federal government offered help to the states that wanted to adopt the standards, these are not federal standards. They were developed by the states, working together. Almost all the experts who have looked at these standards think they can hold their own against the best standards anywhere in the world. Most important, they're the right kind of standards for a nation that must now provide to all of its students a kind and quality of education that is only provided to a small elite before. These standards are the best chance we have of being competitive as individuals and as a nation in a fiercely competitive global economy. So why are these standards being so savagely attacked? The Common Core standards are supported by Barack Obama and by Jeb Bush, by prominent Democratic governors and prominent Republican governors, by the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce, by the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. Those of you who follow the politics of American education will read this list and see that it includes bitter opponents of one another, people who can agree on very little else. It is not a partisan matter. It does not divide management and labor, nor is it a regional matter. So what exactly is it? I will in a moment share with you a list of the most repeated criticisms of the Common Core standards along with my responses to them. In my opinion, this is not so much a list of the things that concern the opponents as a list of things they think they can say that will get them adherents who will work with them to defeat the Common Core. What really seems to unite those who lead the opposition is their very strong antipathy to government at any level, but most especially to the federal government. They appear to be willing to say anything, whether or not it is true, to fight off what they seem to think is a clear and present danger to their freedoms as citizens of the United States. This is hardly surprising. This is a thread in the national political fabric that has been with us since the founding of the United States. Let me share the specifics of the charges with you. They say the Common Core was created by the Obama administration and really represents federal standards, not state standards. As I pointed out to you a moment ago, the developments that led to the Common Core began long before President Obama took office. It was overseen by the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association. It was largely funded by the Gates Foundation. The Obama administration clearly thought that the Common Core was a good idea, and they unabashedly supported it. But that happened after the Common Core effort had been formed and was producing standards. They, the federal government, in the form of the Obama administration, were Johnny-come-latelys. They weren't involved in the production of the standards in any way at all. The opponents charge that the Common Core is the first step on the way to a nationalized education system. This is nonsense. I know of no one who is advocating for a nationalized education system directed by a strong national ministry of education. No one. Germany, which has a constitution that expressly rejects any role for the federal government, their federal government in education beyond education research and statistics, nonetheless has a strong set of national standards for student performance, put together by the lander, their states. Australia has a strong set of national standards, but their states retain the upper hand in education policy for their schools. As long as our national government puts in around 10% of the total cost of elementary and secondary education, there is, in my view, no danger of a federal takeover of our schools. It's not going to happen, and I don't see that changing. And then, of course, there is our Constitution, which reserves decisions about education policy to the states. Not much room there for a federal takeover of our schools. They say the Common Core is unconstitutional and a threat to individual freedoms. Unconstitutional, presumably, because, as I just said, education is a government function reserved to the states. But the Constitution did not prohibit an agreement among the states to agree on standards that they could adopt in common. Nothing unconstitutional about that. Any standards from any origin are a threat to the individual freedoms of those to whom they apply. Standards of practice in engineering and medicine limit what an engineer can design and what a surgeon can do. We have such standards because they are in the public interest. Parents who want to homeschool their children are instinctively leery of any standards that might infringe on their freedom to teach anything they want to any child at any time. The same can be said of many teachers. But as I pointed out above, without such standards, our schools will fall further and further behind the countries that are using higher standards to advance their education system and move their students to higher achievement. They say the Common Core is unproven. There actually is no such thing as a proven standard. A standard is by definition an aspiration. In this case, it is what a society wants for its children. You can't prove that a standard is right or a standard is wrong, that it works or does not work. You can either embrace a standard or choose not to do so. But I must say, if you want to find out whether standards of this sort work or not, look at every one of the top performing countries. They say that a well-known mathematician who was a member of the validation committee for the Common Core has denounced the math standards as too low in relation to the standards set by other countries. This proves, they say, that the standards have been dumbed down. They're not only lower, they say, than the standards of other countries, but also the standards of Massachusetts, Indiana, Texas, Minnesota, and California. Well, it's true that James Milgram was a member of the validation committee, and it's true that he believes the standards are too low. What the critics fail to mention is that in addition to Milgram, there were mathematicians on the committee from Penn State, the University of Michigan, Macalester College, Illinois State, Yale University, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Arizona State University, California Poly, Michigan State, the University of Texas at Austin, and Johns Hopkins University, none of whom agreed with Milgram. In fact, no mathematician involved in producing or formally reviewing the standards agrees with Milgram. The critics will also fail to tell you that virtually every national professional society of mathematicians and scientists have voted to support the Common Core standards. In short, an overwhelming majority of mathematicians supports the Common Core and disagrees with Milgram. Massachusetts was for a long time viewed by many, especially the leading critics of the Common Core, as having the best standards in the country. When the current Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts took office, he commissioned two leading education research organizations to undertake studies comparing the Massachusetts state standards to the Common Core. Both reported that the Common Core standards are at least as high, if not higher, than the Massachusetts standards. And the result was that Massachusetts decided to abandon its own standards and adopt the Common Core. They say the Common Core standards require teachers to abandon the teaching of great American literature. That would be really bad if it were true, but of course it's not. In fact, the critics know it's not true, but they know that it is sure to get a rise out of the public. The authors of the Common Core noted that high school graduates often have a hard time reading the sort of nonfiction that they have been able to read in college or at work. Excuse me, that they have to be able to read. That's an important difference. That they have to be able to read in college or at work, from the Chilton's auto repair manual to a science textbook. So they set standards for that kind of reading. The critics behave as if reading is a zero-sum game, as if the more such reading a student does, the fewer classic novels students will read. But of course that's not true. No one called on the high school English teacher to replace One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with the Chilton's auto repair manual. Didn't happen. The auto repair shop teacher should be making sure that the auto repair student can read that manual. And the science teacher should be making sure that the science student can read the assigned text. No one is calling for fewer classics of American or English literature to be taught in the literature class. The politics of the Common Core are summed up in a confrontation that appeared in the National Review, a standard bearer for American conservatives, and Glenn Beck, in which the National Review offers arguments for the Common Core, and Beck relentlessly attacks the National Review for its support of the Common Core. The apogee of Beck's attack comes when he charges that the Common Core is the launch pad for a massive attack on the privacy of Americans by the federal government. That it will operate an Orwellian system of massive data gathering on every aspect of every student's life and thought. There is actually no basis in fact for this charge, none. The Common Core is not owned, nor is it operated by the federal government. There is no time, this is no time. This is no time to abandon the Common Core or to slow it down. I told you earlier that we are now far behind a growing list of countries that are providing a better education for a larger fraction of their students than we are to ours. If there is something to be alarmed about, it is not the Common Core, but the consequences of our failure to adopt it. We want the United States to recover its predominant position among the countries in the world. In the field of education, there is no more important step you can take than being clear about the high standards you want for your children, and there is no better way to do that than to endorse and support the Common Core state standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for leaving us a long time for questions. I mentioned earlier that there are white cards on the chairs, and I would also recognize Representative Cindy Chase, who would happily go around and collect your cards so that we can, and questions may continue to occur to you as other questions are being responded to. So if you need more cards, those are available as well. There's lots of information to think about, and I'm sure questions abound. So,
Please pass your cards this way, and I'll just get them from
8 minutes. A breather. You have one or two to get started with? I did indicate earlier that if there are several questions on one card, I'll read one question, move on to another card, and as we go through, come back to the cards with multiple questions. So, the first one is, thank you. Is this public/private partnership concept designed to shut out the public voice? Set that one aside for now, and let's go on to this one.
Maybe they could restate it.
Is there someone who submitted that question?
What does that question mean?
Would you like to explain it?
If you read the second half, Manchester's having their school committee meet at Dine Corporation instead of meeting in a public facility where we have public comment. So when you're having this public-private partnership, it's shutting out public comment. So I'm just wondering if that part of the design, or is that just an unfortunate result?
Sounds like a question for you.
That's really a local decision, and that is something that New Hampshire prides itself on, that we are a local control state. And so if a district chooses to operate in that manner, well then that is a local decision. That's the best I can do. Let me see. The next question is, please explain how having standards up to Algebra 2 and some trig be a higher standard.
I think I know what that question means. Here is the question. I think that many people are asking that's related to the one that was just read. The charge that James Milgram made was that the mathematics standards are too low relative to the standards of other countries. And let me tell you what I believe the framers of the math standards in the Common Core actually did, and why I think they did it, and why I agree with them. If you look at the standard progression of mathematics in secondary education in the United States, it goes Algebra 1, Trigonometry and Geometry, Algebra 2, Pre-Calculus, and Calculus. And that is a progression that is designed to get you to calculus. That's the purpose of it. So if you look at the Common Core state standards, they tell you what they think kids ought to be studying in mathematics through grade 10. They give you some options for grades 11 and 12. Why would they have done that? Here's why. If you look, imagine now that what you're trying to do is to produce a set of standards which will give students the skills they need for college or for going into the workforce when they leave high school. There seems to be a growing national agreement in the United States that that's the objective. So our organization did a study, took 2.5 years of fairly intensive research, looking at a sample of community colleges around the country and asking what the real standard was for being successful in those community colleges. They all have a course, it's the most difficult math course freshmen in community colleges take, called College Math. What we discovered was that the content of that course is basically Algebra 1.25. The content is the topics taught in Algebra 1, plus a little bit of what goes on in statistics and some related subjects, just a tad. So we asked ourselves, there are a lot of people advocating in this country right now, James Milgram is one of them, kids should not be allowed to graduate high school without having mastered Algebra 2. I have yet to have anybody tell me why kids should be required to have mastered Algebra 2 in high school in order to study Algebra 1 in college. Doesn't make any sense to me. It's also the case that what you find is that a very large fraction of kids coming out of our high schools are not ready for college math in our community colleges and four-year colleges. I don't know how many of you in this room are legislators, but I would put it to you, would you actually want to have Algebra 2 mastering Algebra 2 as a requirement for getting a high school diploma in New Hampshire, if you knew that a very large majority of New Hampshire kids would then never get a diploma? And why would you do that? Why would you not do that? Now, let me point out something else that we discovered in the course of our research. Somewhat less than 5% of the entire American workforce needs the calculus in the work that it does. Why would you put all of our kids on a path to the calculus if you knew that only 5% of them would ever need the calculus when they actually went into the workforce? We couldn't come up with a good answer to that one either. Now, if you stop the argument there, it sounds like I'm arguing for dumbing down the standards. I'm not. I think our standards ought to be a lot higher than they are now. A lot higher. The question I think that we ought to be asking ourselves is, what math do kids need? What math do kids need? Algebra 2 is being used right now in the United States in the same way that Latin was used at the turn of the last century as a gate to keep kids out of college. You didn't actually need Latin to go to college in the early part of the last century, but it was a very simple gate to put in kids' way to keep them out. Algebra 2 looks a lot like that. the Common Core state standards did was said you need to have Algebra 1 by the 8th grade. And then you need to have a course of mathematics that goes to advanced mathematics that makes sense for you. What would that mean? If you look at what people actually need and use in their work in the United States, there are a lot of them that use trig. Talk to a carpenter or a surveyor and any number of other occupations. If you look at a lot of others, you'll find in industrial processes they use statistics. And some of it is very advanced statistics. That's what they need. So if you look across the range of American occupations, what you'll find is kids need advanced math, but they don't all need the same math. And that's why the Common Core is written the way it is. This is not an argument for kids not going on to advanced math. It is an argument for matching the math that kids are required to take to the things that they want to do with their life, and not requiring all kids to go on a path in mathematics that will get them to a mathematics that only 5% will ever use.
Switching out of the curriculum, can you elaborate on the concerns of privacy and data mining?
This is the Glenn Beck argument I referred to at the end of my remarks. There are, first of all kinds of data is collected about kids and, about kids and about their families in American schools. It's done all the time for all kinds of reasons, and many of them are good reasons. The states have, at least as I understand it, virtually complete control over what is collected, and even more complete control over what is identified. And this is a very important point. There is a fair amount of information that goes to state government and to the federal government that is used for a variety of purposes. And it is almost always the case that the student's name is stripped out of that data, cannot be traced back. But there is nothing, and this is what shall I say? The question about what data is collected and how it is used is an argument we ought to be having with each other. And it'll go on for a long time. It's clearly going to go on for a long time in many arenas. I happen to be concerned about privacy personally. And the loss of it in this country is an enormous personal concern to me. But from my point of view, I don't see what on earth the connection is to the Common Core state standards. There is nothing in the Common Core state standards, nothing in the Common Core state standards that requires the collection of personal information about kids to go to the federal government. It's not going to happen.
But that was my question, and you left out a very important part of it, I believe. Because I had a quote from FERPA, which discussed FERPA, which is the overriding guide to this question. So it's the other half that we need to put out there.
Your question, Representative, may be related to this question, but this question just simply says, can you elaborate on the concerns of privacy? We'll get to your question, I know. Next question. Exactly which countries are the English/math standards, exactly which countries are the English/math standards benchmarked?
I honestly don't know. I know that they did an extensive search of the standards of many other countries, but I do not know the details of that search.
In your article, this is a longer one. In your article,
Let me just add to that.
sorry.
In our own work, and we've done a lot of it, the countries that we benchmark to are the top 10 performers in the PISA rankings. And I suggest that any of you who are interested in following that should get up on the OECD website, go to the PISA web rankings and look at it yourself. They are changing, and they will change again in a few months because PISA is about to come out with its most recent results. But that's what we use. And so my comments when I was talking about comparing our reading of these standards to those of the top performing countries, we are benchmarking to the top 10 of PISA.
In your article, Governing Education Is It Possible? It is obvious to me that this is a job for government. that it is not possible to build a world-class education system on a state or a national scale unless the government designs and runs it. So for you to say that you do not think we can have a world-class education system in the U.S., is it your opinion that the solution to a better education is more government?
No. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Were it up to me, which it is not, some of you would have to know that, I would have the states have somewhat more power in education. I would have the federal government have considerably less. I'm sorry, you can't hear me in the back. I would have the states have somewhat more power in education. I would have the federal government have considerably less. And to the extent that the states have more power in education, it would probably come at the expense of local control. I know that is not a message that goes down well in New Hampshire, but we are discussing a perfectly good example of what I'm talking about. For a very long time in the United States, the standards for what kids were expected to know and be able to do were actually set by school teachers. I was myself a member of a school board in Massachusetts, and I'm speaking from my personal experience. Teachers could largely decide what they were going to teach classroom by classroom. It's the way it's worked in this country for a very long time. And the result of all of that is that when we and others went to look school by school in some selected school districts at what was being taught in mathematics, we discovered that a given topic could be taught in the same school in 4 or 5 different grade levels. And because that was true, when we talked to the kids, what they told us in February is, we were reviewing last year, because the teacher, having kids from who'd started this topic in this grade or that grade or the other grade, gave up and started it again. And so over and over and over again, our kids would get the same topic introduced. When you added up all the time that they spent on that topic, getting it introduced to them, it equaled the amount of time the kids were studying that topic in the top performing countries. But because in those countries, the state had said, you study that topic at this grade level, they went into much more depth, and all the kids in the classroom mastered it before going on to the next one. You need a system. I know it's not always a welcome message, but you need a system. In a country that says you're going to study this topic in mathematics at this grade level, all the teachers can expect the kids, whether they grew up in that district, that town, or on the other side of the country, or in this case a state, expect them to have gotten that material, and they can go on. There's lots more to this, but that one fact alone convinced me a long time ago that there are some things that have to be done by the state. I don't mean the country, I mean the state. Or what you've got is a kind of a controlled chaos. And maybe that's what some people prefer. But I'm here to tell you, as an education policy researcher, it is not what works.
Another question. Since your organization, the NCEE, has received at least $1.5 million from the Gates Foundation, and since Microsoft will benefit tremendously by the technology requirements of Common Core, then why should we think that you are not just a spokesman for Microsoft?
You know, every American foundation...
Raise the mic, please.
I'm trying. It keeps falling. But thank you. Thank you for reminding me.
Assistant is short.
So, almost every American foundation was founded by a rich person. Some of them are alive and some of them are dead. And if you want money to do the kind of work that we do, most of it's going to come from foundations. So if you have a head for conspiracy theories, you can say, oh, the work that these people do is just, they're clearly just mouthpieces for the people who give them the money. Well, You can believe that if you wish. People who know me know better. I've reached that wonderful point in life where I have we have very, very little foundation money now, almost none. And I can say whatever I want to say. And I've been saying it for some time. I'm not a mouthpiece for Bill Gates. I'm not a mouthpiece for the Microsoft company. I'm not a mouthpiece. By the way, the foundation is not the same as the company. This is a mere detail. But I have very little use for conspiracy theories. If you look at where we got our money from over the years, it is many, many different foundations, many different states, and the federal government. So we basically gotten money from almost everybody over the years. You can believe that we're in everybody's pocket, or none. Your choice.
We're back to, and I don't know whether this lady, the representative who raised her hand earlier, are you concerned about data protection and privacy rights with regard to December 2011 amending of our FERPA law, which switched parental consent for sharing information with authorized representatives to include government agencies, trade unions, and companies who develop educational products and services? And the other one is, what do you think about Senator Marc coming out against data mining and Common Core state standards? I'm trying to shuffle through and group these questions around the city.
I actually have not followed the details of her. I have no opinion on this. I just don't know enough about it to have an opinion.
It's important only because what you were saying with the state may be true. With regards to the state holding
Right.
to secure this data. But FERPA is firmly in the camp that when they amended this in 2011, it took parental consent away and said that it could include what we call authorized representatives, which are third-party people. So all of our information that the state will collect does go out of state and goes to several entities, and that is, if you read the FERPA, go to FERPA online, you can read about it. So it's important for us to know.
I understand that it's important. It's just not something I've studied in enough detail to have an opinion about it. But I agree that not only do I understand it's important, I agree that it's important. Like I said, I too am concerned with privacy in the United States. It's a real worry.
This is a prepared question. In your Surpassing Shanghai book, you compare the U.S. to other leading countries and say that if we want to compete globally, we have to change our education system. But the 2011 TIMSS, which is an acronym for Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, results recently released show New Hampshire reached the high benchmark standard in science, and only 5 countries reached that mark. In math, only 4 states scored higher than New Hampshire. Massachusetts was the leading state in both areas. Why then should New Hampshire adopt untested national standards and assessments? Shouldn't we instead adopt Massachusetts standards, since they were the highest scoring state in both math and science?
Well, first, Massachusetts, as I told you earlier, has adopted the Common Core. Maybe you should ask them why they did that. Second, I just wrote, actually, you're looking at a full-time slave. I have a blog to which I am a slave, and one of my recent blogs was right on the study that is being cited here. For those of you who don't follow these arcane matters, the National Center for Education Statistics just published a so-called linking study, which links the results of the latest TIMSS report. For those of you who don't know what TIMSS is, that is the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, which reports on mathematics and science using a common assessment across a large number of countries. And it links those to the NAEP scores that each state gets. And so what that produces, according to them, is an equivalent score, so that you can see how the states would have scored on the TIMSS assessment if we had had TIMSS assessments in those states. That actually, however, is not true. And I'm sorry about this, but I don't know another way of addressing this question. than to tell you about the methodology. If I were to get a group of students here to take the University of Cambridge International General Certificate of Secondary Education tests, probably the world's best known secondary education test, and to take the SATs and the ACTs, I could produce equivalent scores. That is, I could tell you because they would take all tests, they would get, student getting this score on one of those would get that score on another and that score on another. And so you would say they're equivalent. Well, actually they're not, because what the tests are testing is something different. So you have to bear that in mind with respect to this question. The thing that's most important, I think, with respect to these comparisons, however, in this particular case, is that the countries they're comparing are not the same. So the OECD PISA test, this is why we go to OECD PISA, is largely administered, mostly administered to industrialized countries. If you look at the set of countries that took the TIMSS test, you will find out that there is a very long list of countries like Botswana, which took that test. So I don't have the list in my head. If you're really interested, go to Education Week, find my blog, and you'll find the whole list there. But basically, these two supposedly good comparisons did not compare the same set of countries. They're a very different set of countries. So if you want New Hampshire to feel really good about having beaten a whole set of countries like Botswana, that's fine. But you're not beating countries like Shanghai, which topped countries, which topped the PISA assessment the last time around, or a number of other countries which were at the top of the PISA lists, were not in the list of countries tested by TIMSS at all. Very different list. So, yeah, I'm sure that it was not a bad thing to be up near the top of that list, but it doesn't mean that you are among the best countries in the world. It's going to be a long time before that happens.
Here's another question. In an article, and a quote from your Governing American Education article, local control is the source of many of the nation's problems related to education. Can you explain how local control is the source of education problems? And then there's a second question that is also related. Please talk about the fit between national standards and local control.
The fit between national standards and local control. There isn't much of a fit. I don't know how to sugarcoat this. I think the United States has a choice to make. And it's the choice that my remarks were all about. I told you earlier, we had a record more than 100 years long of being ahead of the rest of the world, year after year, decade after decade. And it was the making of this country. According to some of the best economists we've ever had, it was the making of this country. And that came to a stop in the 1970s. If you want to keep everything the way it was, you can look forward to more of the same. I guarantee you. And this country will be in terrible trouble. Winston Churchill said, the United States always does the right thing after it has exhausted all of the alternatives. Well, friends, we have exhausted all of the alternatives. If you want it to be the way it's always been, just look back between here and 1970 and you'll see what we get. What we have gotten is a complete stop to the improvement in education in this country and a continuing increase in its cost. That's what we've got. And it's tearing this country apart. And I guarantee you it will destroy this country if it continues, because the differences in income will destroy the social compact. That's where we are. So I'm not going to sugarcoat this. If you want to have every single community in New Hampshire determining its own standards, that's fine. But you can forget New Hampshire. It will get what it has had. And it's not good enough. It's not good enough for your kids. It's not good enough for the country. One country after another is going right straight past us and making the adjustments they have to make. We're not.
Little change of topic here. Could you talk about assessment? Is this testing? Will it be different from current testing in terms of content? There are a number of questions relative to that.
Yeah, this is a really, really important question, in my view. And I think we have a terrible problem. If you look at the history of testing in other countries, the top performing countries, what you will typically find is that they have something like accountability testing, in the sense that tests that all kids are supposed to take 2 or 3 times in a student's entire school career. Those are different times in different countries, but when you add it up, it's 2 or 3 different times. The tests that they typically take are not capital M-O-T, multiple choice computer score tests. They are essay-based tests. You can't study for them in the sense that you study for multiple choice tests. You can't study the previous tests and say, ha, it's a problem. There's going to be a problem just like this, and practice it by rote memory. It does not work. You can't do it. You have to actually know the material at a pretty deep level. It's like the best essay-based test you all had when you were in college or graduate school, like that. We have a different history in the United States. We actually have 2 histories. We have tests just like I described for our elite kids. Those are the advanced placement tests. They're just like what I described. But for most kids, we have tests that developed after World War I, when American psychologists figured out the system that we've got, multiple choice computer score testing. It is very cheap compared to the tests I just described. What it's really good at, and very efficient at, is determining whether you've got basic skills. But there's no way you can tell whether you can write well, whether you can think well, whether you can in fact do any of the things that the world now requires kids in rich countries to do. That system was put into concrete when No Child Left Behind was passed, and the states were required to administer tests of the kind I just described every single year, grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in English and in mathematics, and at 1 grade in high school, and in science in 1 grade in high school. What that did was put in place a system that required so much expenditure on testing that the states that wanted to have better tests couldn't have better tests because they couldn't afford them. And in my view, this is a disaster for the United States. It has to be changed because we want the kinds of skills that the Common Core State Standard says we ought to want. And obviously, I think we ought to want them. It's the key to our future. We need to have tests that can measure those skills. New Hampshire has been participating in a group of states that I think has been using the best common assessment, that is multi-state assessment, in the United States. You've been really good about this, much better than most other states. I hope you can hang on to that. I hope you can do even better. I think it is really worth fighting for, because it's going to make a big, big difference. It doesn't matter what the standards are if the tests can't assess the standards that you put in place. And it costs money to do that. More money than it does to administer multiple choice computer score tests. I'm
Mary, that was my questions. Can I just have a clarification? That's the goal then of Common Core, is to change the testing.
No, it's not, no. The goal of,
I mean, the testing will match.
it is not the goal of the Common Core to have a different kind of test. You will only achieve the goals of Common Core if you have a different kind
That's
of
what I'm
test.
trying to say.
Right,
I just-
yes, that's right.
So with Common Core, will there be testing, and will it be?
We don't know yet. We
Okay.
don't know yet. There are 2 state consortia that are putting together tests with support from the federal government. The tests that they're putting together are significantly better than the multiple choice computer score test that most states have been using. If I had to choose between those tests and the tests that most states have been using, I would use those in a minute.
Thank you.
And there will, one of the work sessions this afternoon will address the issue in detail of assessment. A recent study putting U.S. states in the mix with other nations showed that New Hampshire is in the top 10, along with 4 other United States states. If we are already doing very well compared to other states and countries, will Common Core make us even better?
Well, I
addressed most of that question a few minutes ago. I don't think you're doing as well as that, because something happened. Oh, it's dead.
Hello? Much better. I guess I did. Thank you. I don't think New Hampshire is doing as well as that, as the superficial reports of that report have suggested, for all the reasons I told you before. You really need to look at the list of countries with which you are being compared before you make that judgment. There was another half to that question. If we're already doing very well compared to other states, will Common Core, well, as I said a moment ago, I don't think you are doing as well as that report suggests. And I think that the Common Core, there's no question in my mind that if the Common Core were fully adopted in New Hampshire, you would be doing better than you're doing.
Conservative educator Hirsch of Virginia wrote and has spoken of core knowledge and the need for well-defined curriculum, which what your child should know. Is the Common Core an echo of Hirsch's program?
I think in many ways it is. Thank you. I think in many ways it is. There are many people, educators and not educators, who think that, oh well, there's so much new knowledge being produced all the time, all kids need is skills. And it is that view that Hirsch has been challenging now for a long time. I am to agree with him. It is not the case that all you need is skills. Again, you just look around the rest of the world and you see that those countries are beating the pants off us because they think kids need both knowledge and skill. And in fact, cognitive psychologists will tell you that you don't have skills in the abstract, you have skills about something. And the about something is the knowledge. So you really need both. And I think that Hirsch is dead right about that. If you look at the Common Core, you will find that the authors of the Common Core agree with that. There is a lot of knowledge, not just skills, that are talked about at length, in detail, and in a pretty sophisticated way in the Common Core state standards.
Relative to cost, how much will this cost? Most states did not do a study on what Common Core would cost before signing on. It appears the costs are enormous, including all new teacher training, curriculum, technology. Care to comment?
Well, what an interesting topic. So the question really is, what does it cost to deliver a good education? Or let me put the question another way. What does it cost to deliver an education which is as successful as the education delivered by the top performing countries? And you'll probably be surprised by the answer. It costs less than the United States on average is spending. We are, now another group of people unhappy in this. But the fact is that there are only 2 countries in the OECD that spend more money per student than the United States spends on education. But they spend it differently. They spend it differently. So there's a really big task in front of the United States to figure out how they spend it differently and why they're getting better results. And that's a conversation New Hampshire ought to have with itself, I think. There are a lot of formulaic answers to that question, all of which are wrong, because it's a very complicated matter. But we need to get underneath why it is that our results have not improved since the 1970s, and the actual cost per student has increased after inflation by 240%. That's the central issue. If we can figure that out, we will figure out how we can have better education for less money. And we need to figure that out.
Could you explain your seeming contradiction of favoring traditional public schools be run by private contractors, but the disdain for public charter schools? I'm not clear.
I understand the question. The author has read one of our reports. So let me see if I can do this quickly. Disdain for public charter schools. I don't have disdain for charter schools. What I think about charter schools is that they're a distraction. And what I mean by that is the following. If you look at the data, and I don't think, by the way, there's a whole lot of disagreement about this from the leading advocates of charter schools. If you look at the data and you look at it at the state level, that is, you go state by state and you look at the difference between the performance of charter schools and regular public schools, what you'll find is there's almost no difference. There are some studies that show us a little bit on the charter school side, and other studies that show a little bit on the public school side, but when you add it all up, there's almost no difference. And when you look at other countries that have charter-like systems, what you find is that it's pretty much the same thing, but there's another piece of it that I think is really important. What you find is that charter-like systems in those countries produce a situation in which people who have choices tend to abandon low-performing schools, and they leave those the low-performing schools are not gone. They're still there. They're occupied by people who don't have those choices. And so what you get is increasing inequality between schools. And for me, that's not a good trade. That is to say, if you're not getting better performance and you're getting less equality, why do you want to do this? Now, the answer for a lot of people is they found a particular charter school that they like. So if you value choice per se, go for it. But if you value charter schools because they perform better, there's no evidence of that. That's what you have this. Let me tell you,
If you took those kids out of the charter school and put them back in the regular school, you would not get the same result. The only reason they're able to keep that.
No, it's okay. If you found a particular charter school that was working well and you put them back in a public school that was not, you're absolutely right. That's not a nice thing to do. What I'm telling you is, if you look at charter schools across entire states, that effect goes away, because what you find is charter schools on balance don't perform any better than the public schools. Individual charter, yes, you're absolutely right. Individual charter schools, I can match up individual charter schools with public schools and I can find that they perform better. But I can show you statistically that the reverse is just as often true. And so, fine, like I said, if you value choice and put it ahead of anything else, go for it. But if you're looking at a public policy tool to improve the outcome, that's what I'm about. I'm looking at the performance of the United States and states in the United States and comparing it to other countries. And we're falling further and further and further behind. And there's no evidence that implementing charter schools is going to change that at all. Yes.
We're going to change the topic because this is a very important one. Excuse me, Representative Cordelli. This one addresses one of Governor Hassan's priorities in education. Have you done it, and I felt that it is a necessary question. Have you done any studies to see if children who were taught higher level math, to see if they were more likely to enter the STEM fields? because as we know, STEM is the in-word relative to education right now.
Well, I've not personally done any studies, but it is certainly the case. I'll just invert what I said before. If you want your child to go into a field which some people would characterize, this is hard. STEM fields covers an enormous territory. So there are some STEM fields that require the calculus, and there are other STEMs that don't even come close. But let's assume that what the question really means is, do you have to know more math in order to go into a career that requires the calculus? Well, the obvious answer to that is you better know the calculus, right? So the question is, the question contains its own answer. I don't know what else to say. As I said earlier, fewer than 5% of the occupations in the United States actually require the calculus.
And then the last question, because we are getting close to our time, and Dr. Tucker has been very generous in responding to these. In 5 minutes, how will Common Core improve education for our children?
That was a softball. I think the bottom line here is that the Common Core, if it works, if it is really implemented, will raise everybody's expectations for our kids. That's how it's going to make a difference. What the record shows is that Americans expect less of their kids than the countries with better performing systems. And they're happier with lower performance. Over and over and over again, the Gallup poll, every single year, shows that Americans think that the performance of the American education system is in the drink, but their own schools are doing fine. And as long as their own schools are doing fine, they're not going to want to change it. What the Common Core is going to do is change that. They're going to get people to understand that we need to ask more of our children. We need to expect them to be able to do more, and we need to communicate that to our kids and to our teachers. It's like what I said at the beginning of my remarks. There is not a single nation that is doing better than we are that has not started with standards, that has not begun with the importance of communicating to everybody in the system, and parents and kids, that more needs to be expected, and making it clear what that more is. You cannot get there if you don't know where you're going. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your remarks and also for your generous responses. And I know there will be some people who may want to question you during the break, which we're about to do. I would also like to thank Mark for leaving copies of his entire speech, which will be available on the table outside the room 210 and 211. So with that, I'm giving you an extra couple of minutes for coffee break, which coffees and pastries are available in room 212. And then we will reconvene here for the panel on the strengths and challenges, or the successes and challenges of implementing Common Core. And our panel will include professionals from various roles in education. So thank you, and see you in 15 minutes at 4:15. Thank you.
The naysayers came prepared with me. I just thought you were